The rain-slick marble floor of Carradine Tower had seen billion-dollar deals, high-profile scandals, and more power plays than a chessboard in Midtown, but never this. At 9:04 a.m., a 7-year-old girl pushed through the revolving doors, drowning in a coat 3 sizes too big, clutching a one-eyed teddy bear. She didn't speak. She just handed the receptionist a crumpled note with 9 words that made the blood drain from her face. "This is Daisy. She's looking for Callum Lowell, her father." What happened next stopped the entire building cold. The lobby of Carradine Tower was designed to impress. All sleek glass, black marble, and quiet hums of money being made behind polished doors. Everyone who entered usually did so with a purpose, a firm stride, a badge clipped, an appointment confirmed by 3 different assistants. But on that rainy Thursday morning, just after 9 a.m., a child walked through the revolving doors, and nothing would be the same again. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her sneakers left tiny wet prints on the marble as she walked, slow and deliberate, hugging a threadbare teddy bear to her chest. Her coat was 3 sizes too big, sleeves dragging past her hands. Her brown hair was tucked messily under a knitted cap, and though her face was pale, her eyes were wide and unflinching. The receptionist, a woman named Kendra, who had worked at the front desk for 5 years without ever witnessing something like this, stood so fast she knocked her coffee to the floor. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" The girl didn't speak. She walked right up to the massive Carradine and Lowell logo mounted on the wall behind the front desk and stopped. She looked at it like it meant something more than just letters. Her eyes traveled across the lobby, scanning every inch. Security officers in Navy uniforms, assistants moving too fast, people laughing into phones without a clue that something extraordinary was unfolding just 10 feet away. Kendra came around the desk, softening her voice. "Where are your parents, honey?" The girl blinked slowly. Then she reached into her oversized coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it silently to Kendra, who hesitated before opening it. There were only 3 lines scrawled in shaky handwriting. "This is Daisy. She's looking for Callum Lowell. She says he's her father." The blood drained from Kendra's face. Callum Lowell, CEO, billionaire, man of the hour in every financial magazine for the past decade, the name whispered with awe and sometimes fear in the upper floors. No one just walked in off the street and asked for Callum Lowell, and certainly not a little girl with no ID, no adult, and a teddy bear missing one eye. Kendra stared at the note again, then at the girl, Daisy. "She says he's her father." It made no sense. Callum Lowell didn't have children. The man's entire life was public domain, dissected by journalists and investors and rivals alike. There'd never been a hint of anything like this. No scandal, no paternity claims, nothing. And yet, here stood Daisy. The security guards were already starting toward them, alerted by Kendra's expression and the obvious breach of lobby protocol. Kendra held up a hand to stop them, though she wasn't even sure why. Something about the way the little girl stood there, not afraid, but expectant, like she knew this moment would come. "I need to make a call," Kendra murmured, more to herself than anyone else. She ushered Daisy gently behind the desk and picked up the phone. Her hands shook slightly as she dialed the executive line, Callum's personal assistant, Jody. "Jody, you need to come down to the lobby right now. No, don't ask, just come. And bring Mr. Lowell." Jody's voice, always composed, cracked. "He's in a board meeting with the Japanese investors. Tell him it's urgent. Tell him a girl named Daisy is here, says she's his daughter." Silence. Then, "I'll get him." Kendra hung up and crouched beside Daisy, who was now perched on the receptionist's chair, swinging her legs slowly. The teddy bear rested in her lap. Kendra forced a smile. "You okay, sweetie? You hungry? Thirsty?" Daisy looked up with a solemn expression and shook her head. "I just want to see him." "Do you know him?" Kendra asked gently. "Have you met him before?" Daisy hesitated. My mom showed me pictures. He used to smile in them, but not all of them. Some he looked tired. Kendra nodded, trying to make sense of it. And your mom? She died, Daisy said quietly, a week ago. I found the letter in her things. She said if anything ever happened, I was supposed to come here to find him. Kendra's throat went tight. Before she could say more, the elevator dinged. Everyone turned. Two figures stepped out. Jody, white as paper, and behind her, Callum Lowell himself, towering, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, tie slightly loosened from the morning's boardroom battle. His face was unreadable, the face that had once made headlines for outmaneuvering half of Wall Street, until his eyes landed on the girl, and something in him cracked. He stopped walking, didn't speak, just stared at the small figure sitting behind the receptionist desk, arms wrapped around a worn bear, legs swinging, hair tucked into a knit cap that made her look smaller than she already was. "Sir?" Jody whispered. But he didn't answer her, couldn't. His mouth moved once, then again. "Daisy?" he said, barely audible. The girl stood slowly, eyes fixed on him. She clutched the bear tighter, stepped around the desk, and walked until there was only a few feet of marble between them. "You look the same," she said softly. "Just older." The room held its breath. Callum dropped to his knees. Right there in front of a stunned lobby full of employees and executives and confused onlookers, the man who had never once let the world see him vulnerable cried. He pressed his hands to his face and wept, not with shame, not with regret, but with the weight of something too long buried. And Daisy, without hesitation, walked into his arms like she'd known this moment her whole life. For a few long seconds, no one moved. Even the security guards, so often trained to act decisively in moments of unpredictability, remained frozen in place. It was as if time itself had taken a breath. Callum Lowell, the man whose empire stretched across continents, who had once been described by Forbes as a fortress of composure, was kneeling on the cold marble floor of his own building with tears on his face and a little girl in his arms. Daisy didn't say anything at first. She just let him hold her, her tiny arms wrapped tightly around his neck, her cheek pressed against his shoulder like she'd found the one place in the world where she could finally stop bracing for impact. Callum's hands trembled as he cradled the back of her head. "I didn't know," he whispered into her hair, voice raw, unsteady. "God, Daisy, I didn't know." Behind them, whispers rippled through the lobby like wind through glass. Executives whispered to assistants. Phones were lifted, lowered, forgotten. But no one dared interrupt. The sight before them wasn't just unexpected. It was something sacred, something that made even the most hardened deal-makers feel like children again, witnessing something too pure to question. Jody stepped forward, her eyes glassy, and crouched carefully beside them. "Sir," she said softly, "should I call someone? Should we?" "No," Callum said immediately, pulling Daisy closer. "Just give us a minute." Daisy didn't flinch at the sound of his voice. She only pulled back enough to look at him properly. Her eyes, so achingly familiar now that he could really see them, searched his face with a quiet, heartbreaking seriousness. "My mom's name was Ellie," she said, and the name hit him like a wave. Ellie. Callum blinked hard, a rush of memory breaking over him. Ellie's laugh in the back of that crowded bar, the way her hair fell over her eyes when she was tired, how she never asked him for anything, even when she should have. He hadn't seen her in almost 8 years. They'd had something messy, tender, brief. And when they parted ways, she'd made it clear she didn't want his money or his future. "I'm not your complication, Cal," she'd said, kissing his cheek. "Don't look for me." And he hadn't. He'd buried himself in his company, in deadlines, acquisitions, flights and meetings, and late nights that blurred into years. He never even thought to question what she meant by that final goodbye. "I didn't know," he repeated, helpless now. "She said you were busy, Daisy said, her voice careful. "And important. But she told me about you. She showed me your picture once on a magazine cover. She said I had your eyes." Callum reached up and wiped at his cheeks. He couldn't remember the last time he'd cried, maybe not since his father's funeral. But here he was, undone by a girl with a teddy bear and a quiet gaze that held more understanding than any boardroom he'd ever stood in. "How did you get here?" he asked, trying to gather himself. "I took a bus," she said simply. "After the funeral. I had the money from Mom's emergency jar. She wrote the address in a notebook and said if anything ever happened, I had to find you." Callum's hands curled into fists against the floor. He imagined Daisy, this brave, fragile child, boarding a Greyhound alone, navigating terminals and cities with nothing but a bear and a letter. "You shouldn't have had to do that," he murmured. "You should never have been alone." "But I'm not now," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. The simplicity of it unraveled him all over again. Jody, still crouching nearby, cleared her throat gently. "Sir, maybe we should go upstairs, somewhere quieter?" Callum looked around for the first time, seeing the stunned expressions on the faces gathered in the lobby. His employees, his advisors, his board. He had built a fortress of intimidation around himself, and now the walls were shattered in full view of everyone. But he didn't care. "Yeah," he said, standing slowly with Daisy still in his arms. "Let's go upstairs." Jody led the way to the private executive elevator. Callum followed, his grip firm around Daisy, the teddy bear wedged between them like a guardian of memory. As the doors closed behind them, he exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. Daisy looked up at him as the elevator rose. "You're taller than I thought," she said. Callum laughed, a soft, disbelieving sound. "You're braver than anyone I've ever met." The 48th floor was quiet when the elevator opened. It was where his private office sat, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the skyline, a space designed to intimidate. But today it felt too cold, too vast. He didn't want Daisy to see him behind a desk like some king on a throne. So instead of walking toward it, he turned left and opened the door to the lounge, a smaller room with leather chairs and a couch, bookshelves and soft light. He set Daisy down gently on the couch. She kept hold of the bear. "Do you want something to eat?" he asked. "Or drink? I have snacks in the kitchen, or we can order whatever you want." "I'm okay," she said, but her voice had started to tremble now, the adrenaline giving way to exhaustion. She looked smaller suddenly, like the weight of the last week was catching up with her all at once. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered. "Anything." She hesitated, then looked at him, eyes wide and quiet. "Are you going to keep me?" The question stopped his breath, not because he didn't know the answer, but because she asked it with such innocence, like she'd accepted the possibility that this might just be another stop, another goodbye. Callum knelt in front of her, took both her hands in his. "I don't know how this works," he said honestly. "I've never been a father before. I don't know what to do, but I'm not going to let you go. Not now. Not ever." Daisy didn't cry, but her lower lip wobbled. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. "That's what Mom said you'd say," she whispered. And for the first time in a very long time, Callum Lowell didn't feel like a man chasing power. He felt like someone finally coming home. Callum sat beside Daisy on the couch, not quite knowing how to breathe now that she was here, real and close enough to touch. He had negotiated billion-dollar mergers, dismantled competitors with a flick of his signature pen, and faced down entire boards without flinching. But this little girl with the feather-soft voice and the ghost of her mother in her smile reduced him to something breakable. She reached for his hand almost shyly, and when he closed his fingers around hers, he felt it. That unmistakable click of something falling into place, as if her palm had always belonged in his, and he just hadn't known it until now. He looked at her again, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way her lashes brushed against her skin when she blinked, the pale pink of her knuckles where she gripped the teddy bear. The bear, he noticed now, was coming apart at the seams. One ear had been sewn back on, the stitching clumsy but careful, probably done by Ellie. Callum swallowed against the sudden lump in his throat. "Did she tell you anything else?" he asked quietly. "About me?" Daisy nodded. "She said you used to be kind, even when you didn't want people to know." That made him smile, though it hurt. "That sounds like her." "She said you loved too hard sometimes. That's why she left." He nodded slowly, eyes on the skyline beyond the glass. She was right. There was a silence between them then, soft and full, not awkward, just deep, like the space between notes in a song that means more than the melody. "Is this your house?" Daisy asked, peering around the plush lounge with wide eyes. He chuckled. "No, this is where I work. My house isn't far from here, though. It's quiet, big, too big for just me." She tilted her head. "Can I come see it?" His heart stuttered. "If you want to," he said carefully. "We'll need to talk to some people first. Make sure it's okay, but yes, I'd like that." Daisy leaned back against the armrest, pulling her knees up under her coat. "I don't like sleeping in strange places. The house we were in before, after the hospital, it smelled weird, like bleach and sad." Callum couldn't breathe for a second. "That's over now," he said. "I promise." "Are promises always true?" she asked, so softly it was almost a whisper. He looked at her. "They should be. And mine will be." Daisy nodded slowly, accepting that. Not fully, maybe, but enough for now. A gentle knock sounded at the door. Jody entered, holding 2 cups, 1 coffee, 1 hot chocolate. She crossed the room slowly, careful not to startle Daisy, and set the cocoa down on the table with a tiny smile. "Hi, Daisy," she said kindly. "I'm Jody. I work with your dad." Daisy's eyebrows furrowed. "He's my dad?" Jody blinked. "Oh, I mean—" Callum cut in gently. "It's okay. You can say it." Daisy looked at him. "Are you?" He smiled then, not with confidence, but with quiet certainty. "I'd like to be, if you'll have me." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she picked up the cup of cocoa, took a slow sip, and said, "Okay." Jody glanced between them, eyes misting. "Sorry to interrupt. There's someone downstairs from Child Protective Services. They were contacted after a child was seen entering the building alone. Standard protocol." Callum nodded. Of course. The world outside this room hadn't stopped, even if his had. "I'll talk to them," he said. "But I want to stay here with her." Jody hesitated. "They may want to ask her questions." He looked at Daisy. "Are you okay with that? I'll be right next to you." Daisy nodded bravely. "If you stay, it's okay." Jody left to make arrangements, and 20 minutes later a woman in her late 30s entered. Sensible shoes, soft expression, a clipboard hugged to her chest. Her name was Clara, and she introduced herself kindly to both of them, then asked to speak with Daisy while Callum remained nearby. The questions were gentle. How she got there, whether anyone had hurt her, where she'd been staying. Daisy answered each one in her soft, direct way, eyes occasionally flicking to Callum as though checking to see if it was okay. When she said her mother had died, Clara's expression softened even more. She nodded sympathetically, but her pen never stopped moving. Callum sat there with his fists clenched in his lap, forcing himself not to interrupt, not to break the moment to pull Daisy into his arms and shield her from every question. But he knew the process had to happen. The system required boxes to be checked, procedures to be followed. "I'll need to arrange a temporary placement," Clara said after the interview, speaking directly to Callum now, "usually a foster family or youth shelter, until guardianship can be clarified." "No," Callum said instantly. "She's coming with me." Clara didn't flinch. She'd clearly heard it before. "Mr. Lowell, I understand how you feel, but custody requires—" "I have lawyers, resources. I'll do whatever needs to be done, but I won't let her go into the system." Clara looked at Daisy, then back at him. "And you're certain she's yours?" "I wasn't," he said. "But now, I am." Clara studied them both for a long moment. She wasn't cruel, just careful. "I'll need a paternity test," she said at last, "and emergency guardianship paperwork." "You'll have it," he said. "I'll also need to verify the mother's identity and circumstances of death." "I can help with that," Callum said, though the words nearly caught in his throat. "Her name was Eleanor Hart. I can give you everything I know." Clara nodded, made more notes, and finally stood. "Until the paperwork is filed, she'll need to stay with an approved guardian. However," she glanced at Daisy, "given the circumstances, I believe an exception can be made for the next 24 hours. She can stay with you tonight, under observation. But tomorrow morning, we'll need to formalize everything." Callum's shoulders dropped. "Thank you." He turned to Daisy, who had watched the entire exchange without a word. "Looks like you're coming home with me," he said softly. Daisy smiled for the first time. A small, quiet smile that didn't light up her whole face yet, but hinted at what it might become. The drive to Callum's estate was quiet, but not in a heavy way. It was a kind of silence that allowed things to settle. Daisy sat in the back seat, still clutching her bear, eyes drifting to the window and the passing city lights. The car, a sleek black SUV with leather seats and the faint smell of cedar, was worlds away from the buses she'd taken just days earlier, but she didn't seem awed or overwhelmed. She seemed calm. Callum watched her through the rearview mirror more than he watched the road. Every time she turned her head, every time her fingers adjusted the bear's ragged bow tie, it struck him all over again. She was his. Maybe not on paper. Not yet. But in every other way that mattered. When they pulled up to the gates of his home, the guard inside the booth did a double-take. Callum rolled down the window. "She's with me," he said simply. The guard nodded, opened the gates, and they drove up the winding driveway until the house came into view. Modern glass and wood, clean lines, large windows glowing warm against the night. It wasn't a place built for a child, Callum realized. It was built for solitude. That would change. He parked and stepped out quickly, coming around to open the rear door for Daisy. She looked up at the house, blinking slowly. "Is this really yours?" "For now," he said with a half-smile. "I was starting to think it was too big for one person." Daisy slipped her hand into his as they walked toward the door. She didn't say anything else, but her grip tightened as they stepped inside. The foyer was pristine. Stone floors, minimalist furniture, tall ceilings. Too clean, Callum thought. Too cold. He saw it through her eyes and hated it instantly. "I'll show you your room," he said. "You can have anyone you want." She didn't answer right away, just walked softly behind him as he led her through the hall, past the kitchen with its spotless counters, past the living room where not a single pillow was out of place. Finally, he stopped at the room furthest down the hall. It had a large window that looked out into the garden and a bed that had only ever been used by guests. "I know it's not much yet," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "but we can fix it. You can pick the colors, the furniture, whatever you want." Daisy wandered in slowly. She walked up to the bed and pressed her hand to the comforter like she was testing whether it was real. Then she turned and looked at him. "Can I keep my bear here?" He smiled. "Of course. You can keep anything here. It's your room." She set the bear on the pillow, carefully positioning it so it was sitting up, its one eye facing the door. Callum didn't know what else to say. He hadn't prepared for this, not the logistics, not the emotions, not any of it. But something about Daisy made it simple. He didn't have to know everything. He just had to show up. "I'll let you change," he said gently. "If you need anything, I'm just down the hall, okay?" She nodded. "Okay." He stepped out, leaving the door ajar. In the kitchen, he moved around with awkward precision, trying to remember the last time he'd made something other than coffee or whiskey. He settled on peanut butter toast and warm milk, which felt like something a kid might accept. When he returned to her room, she was curled on the bed with the comforter pulled to her chin. The bear sat next to her, and her eyes were open, watching the doorway. "I made you something," he said quietly, offering the plate and cup. Daisy sat up and took it carefully. She nibbled the toast like someone who wasn't hungry, but didn't want to be rude. "Thank you," she said. He sat at the edge of the bed, careful not to get too close. "You don't have to say that if you don't feel it." "I do," she paused. "No one's ever made me toast before." That sentence hit him harder than anything else had that day. "Get some sleep," he said, standing. "You're safe here, Daisy, I promise." She looked up. "Will you be here in the morning?" "Every morning." She seemed to weigh that, then gave a small nod. Callum turned out the light, leaving just the soft glow of a night lamp by the dresser. He watched the rise and fall of her breath, listened for a moment as it slowed into something steady. Then he stepped out and closed the door. In his own room, he lay awake for hours. The house didn't feel like his anymore, not in the usual way. It felt like something was shifting, reshaping itself around the space Daisy now occupied. For the first time in years, he thought about adding color to the walls, toys, laughter, maybe even a dog. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, the interviews, the paperwork, the long, meticulous climb to becoming something official in her life. But he did know this: he wouldn't leave her, not ever again. The next morning he was awake before the sun. He made eggs, burned the first batch, laughed at himself, and tried again. When Daisy padded into the kitchen with sleep-tousled hair and the bear still tucked under one arm, he smiled. "I made breakfast," he said. "No toast this time." She sniffed the air and gave him a sleepy grin. "Smells better than the bus station." He pulled out a chair for her. "That's the standard I'm going for." They ate quietly, the way people do when they're still learning each other's rhythms. When she finished, he handed her a new toothbrush and a soft hoodie he'd ordered late the night before, after realizing she had almost no clothes. It was pink with a tiny embroidered fox on the chest. Daisy held it against herself like it was something delicate and rare. "Can I keep this?" she asked. "It's yours." She looked at him, eyes wide. "For real?" "For always," he said. The social worker returned that morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Clara stood at the door in a slate-gray coat, clipboard in one hand, a calm expression on her face that had the practiced neutrality of someone who'd walked into 100 different homes and seen everything from chaos to perfection. Callum invited her in with a polite nod. Stepping aside so she could enter the house he'd already begun to see differently. Daisy was curled on the couch in the lounge, her bear in her lap, watching a nature documentary on mute. She looked up when Clara walked in, then looked to Callum, her silent question. He smiled softly. "She's the one we talked to yesterday." Daisy gave a shy nod, then turned her attention back to the screen, but Callum could see the stiffness in her shoulders. She was waiting, listening. Clara walked through the main rooms with measured steps, occasionally glancing at the furniture, the light fixtures, the absence of clutter. "Your home is beautiful," she said neutrally, not as a compliment, but as a data point. "It wasn't made for a child," Callum admitted. "That will change." Clara nodded, jotting something down. "Do you have plans for a nursery or child-safe space?" "Yes. I've already spoken to a contractor. We'll start next week, if I'm allowed to proceed." She looked at him then, her eyes searching. "You're taking this seriously." "I'm not playing house," he said, voice quiet. "This isn't about image or guilt or anything other than the fact that she is mine, and she needs someone. I want to be that someone." Clara studied him a beat longer, then asked to speak with Daisy privately. He hesitated. "Of course." As he stepped away to give them space, he hovered just around the corner, not listening, but not going far either. 10 minutes passed, then 15. When Clara emerged, Daisy followed behind her, holding her bear like a shield. "She says she wants to stay with you," Clara said softly. I don't need to tell you how unusual that is for a child who's just lost their parent. Most kids are either withdrawn or defiant. She's neither, just cautious, quiet, but steady. She's braver than anyone I know, Callum said. Clara gave a slight smile. I believe you. They sat at the kitchen table while she reviewed the process. You'll need to file for emergency guardianship today. The paternity test can be fast-tracked, but it may still take several days. Once we have results, and if the paperwork is in order, you can petition for temporary custody. After that, it becomes a question of full guardianship or adoption. Callum nodded slowly. Whatever needs to be done, I'll do it. Even if it means letting the courts examine your entire life? They can start today if they want to. Clara didn't argue. Instead, she pulled out the forms and began walking him through them line by line. Medical history, financial disclosures, emergency contacts, home stability. When they reached the section on next of kin, Callum paused. I don't have family. Not really. No siblings. My parents passed years ago. The company has always been my life. Clara nodded. That's more common than you think. He glanced at the lounge where Daisy sat, watching birds on the screen now. Not anymore. It took most of the morning to complete the packet. Clara took the documents, scanned copies of his identification, and promised to expedite everything she could. Before she left, she crouched down in front of Daisy once more. You're very brave, she said, and very loved. Daisy didn't answer, but she leaned against Callum's leg when Clara rose to go. They spent the afternoon in the garden. The sun peeked out after 2 days of rain, and Callum carried 2 mugs, one coffee, one warm milk, to the patio. Daisy wore the hoodie he gave her and wandered among the plants, stopping every few feet to crouch down and inspect things, snails, mushrooms, fallen leaves. I've never had a garden before, she said. You do now. She smiled slightly, then frowned. Will I have to go somewhere else? Eventually, yes, Callum said gently. To school, or maybe to meet with people who ask questions. But you're not going anywhere without me, okay? You and I are a team. Like me and Bear? He laughed. Exactly. That night after dinner, pasta, which Callum learned she liked with just butter and no sauce, he found himself reading aloud from an old children's book he kept in a storage box labeled Donations, and had never gotten around to giving away. Daisy curled against his side on the couch, eyes drooping, Bear tucked between them like a quiet seal of trust. By the time he carried her back to bed, she was fast asleep. He tucked her in, careful not to wake her, and stood at the door for a long time, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, feeling something in his ribcage ache in the most unfamiliar, welcome way. When he turned out the light and stepped into the hallway, he saw Jody waiting with her coat still on. She'd come by to drop off paperwork from legal, but now she stood quietly, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite name. What? He asked. You're different, she said simply. In a good way. He shrugged, trying to smile. Guess I had it in me. You always did, she said. You just never needed to find it. Until now. Callum didn't answer. He didn't have to. The next few days passed in a blur of appointments. The paternity test was expedited, the paperwork reviewed, the emergency guardianship provisionally approved by a family court judge who had clearly expected to be dealing with something more scandalous. When the DNA results came back, Callum opened the email with a breath he didn't know he was holding. Probability of paternity, 99.9999%. He stared at the numbers for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to Daisy's room, and knocked. She opened the door, still in her pajamas, holding Bear by the ear. What's wrong? She asked, frowning. Nothing, he said, kneeling in front of her. Nothing at all. I just wanted to tell you. It's official. What is? I'm really your dad. She blinked. You weren't sure before? I hoped, he said. Now I know. Daisy tilted her head. I already knew. He laughed, pulled her into his arms, and held her for a long, long time. The day they walked into court for the official custody hearing, Daisy was holding his hand so tightly that Callum's fingers had gone numb by the time they passed through security. He didn't tell her. He didn't care. If she needed to hold on, she could hold on as long as she wanted. She wore a new dress that Jody had helped him pick out, soft yellow with little embroidered sunflowers. Her hair was braided neatly, her tiny shoes polished until they looked almost too formal for a 7-year-old. Bear was tucked under her other arm, dressed in a bow tie Callum had added to make him court-ready. Callum wore a suit like he always did, charcoal gray, no tie, no cufflinks, because he didn't want to look like a man trying to buy custody. He wanted to look like what he was, a man who had finally found the one thing that made his life make sense. The courtroom was sterile, all pale walls and straight-backed benches. The judge was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense tone, the kind who had seen too many tragedies and not enough endings that looked like hope. Callum sat with Daisy at a small table near the front. Across the aisle, a representative from Child Protective Services reviewed the file one last time. Clara, the social worker who had come to the house, sat nearby with a calm, quiet presence. She nodded once to Callum, like a silent vote of confidence. The hearing was formal but brief. The judge asked him to explain in his own words why he wanted custody of Daisy. He stood, and for a moment the room fell away. He didn't think about the legal language Margaret had drilled into him. He didn't think about optics or headlines or the risk of opening his private life to public record. He looked at Daisy. "I didn't know she existed until she walked into my building," he said. "But the second I saw her, really saw her, I knew. I didn't feel like I was gaining a child. I felt like I was being given back a piece of myself I didn't even know I'd lost." He glanced at the judge, then back at Daisy. "She's not a charity case. She's not a problem to be fixed. She's my daughter, and I want to give her everything I have for the rest of my life." There was silence when he sat down. Daisy looked up at him, eyes wide and glistening, and reached for his hand again. The judge reviewed the file, the DNA confirmation, the emergency guardianship, Clara's glowing report, a stack of affidavits from staff, lawyers, and family friends who had watched the past few weeks unfold. Then, in a voice softened by what Callum swore might have been emotion, she said, "I find that placement with Mr. Lowell is in the child's best interest, and I hereby grant full custody to the petitioner, Callum Everett Lowell." Daisy looked at him. He looked at her. And then she launched herself into his arms with so much force he almost fell out of his chair. He caught her, laughing, choking, feeling his throat close up around a sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a laugh. Something raw and real that felt like both. They clung to each other in the middle of the courtroom while Clara smiled softly, and the judge cleared her throat and banged the gavel once. It was done. It was real. On the courthouse steps, Callum knelt beside Daisy as the late morning sun filtered through the city haze. "You want to go get pancakes?" he asked. She nodded. "With whipped cream?" She nodded faster. He brushed a stray curl back behind her ear. "You and me, kid, from now on." She held his hand like it was a lifeline. From now on. Their life didn't become perfect overnight. No life ever does, but it became theirs. The first weeks were a blur of late-night story times, spilled juice, mismatched socks, and moments when Callum would wake up and have to remind himself it wasn't a dream, that Daisy was just down the hall, fast asleep, breathing steady, Bear tucked under one arm. She started school 2 weeks after the court hearing. Callum drove her on the first day in a black SUV that felt far too intimidating for a second-grade parking lot. Daisy wore a pink backpack and clutched his hand until the teacher came out to greet them. He crouched beside her before she walked through the gate. "You don't have to be the bravest kid here today," he said softly. "You just have to be you." She looked at him with that same wide-eyed gaze she'd given him the very first day in the lobby. "Will you be here when it's done?" "Every time." When she walked through the gate, he stayed until she disappeared into the classroom. And then he waited outside long after the other parents had left, just in case she needed to know someone was still there. Every day he showed up. Every day he learned something new. That she didn't like ketchup on anything. That she hated loud noises unless it was thunder, which she said made her feel small in a good way. That she loved drawing houses, just like the one she imagined before he ever brought her home. She put pictures on the fridge, started calling the guest bedroom the art room, picked out the color blue for her new walls, and asked him if it was okay to hang a poster of an astronaut, even if I'm not a boy. Callum laughed. You can be anything you want in this house. I want to be safe, she said. You already are. Nights were the hardest sometimes. On the anniversary of her mother's passing, Daisy curled up on the couch with Bear and asked very quietly, Do you miss her too? Callum nodded. I didn't know her the way you did, but yeah, I do. She always said I was strong. You are. I didn't feel strong when she left. You don't have to feel it, he said. You already are, just by being here, just by waking up and trying again. Daisy crawled into his lap that night, fell asleep with her cheek against his chest. And Callum, who had once measured success by net worth, who had once built a life out of unfeeling towers of steel and glass, held her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered, because she was, because she would always be. Spring came slowly, stretching golden light across the hardwood floors of Callum's once sterile home, warming the corners that had never before held laughter. Where silence had once reigned, there were now sounds, soft footsteps at dawn, the rustling of picture books, Daisy's quiet hums as she colored at the kitchen island. The transformation wasn't just inside the house, it was inside him. Callum found himself waking up earlier than he ever had, not to check emails or rehearse a pitch, but to make Daisy's lunch exactly the way she liked it. Cucumber slices without the skin, peanut butter on only one side of the bread, and a folded note tucked in like a secret message. At first the notes were simple. You're amazing. You've got this. I'm proud of you. But then Daisy started writing back. She would slip her replies into the empty lunchbox and leave it on the kitchen counter each evening. Thank you for the hoodie. Bear says hi. Can we go to the park tomorrow? He saved every note. He wasn't sure when his home stopped being a fortress and started becoming a sanctuary. But somewhere between bath time stories and emergency 8 p.m. ice cream runs, it happened. Daisy stopped flinching when he raised his voice on phone calls. She stopped waking in the night and creeping into the hallway to check that he was still there. She started calling him Dad. The first time it was accidental, or maybe it wasn't. They were leaving the dentist's office, Daisy gripping a balloon and Bear tucked under one arm, and she turned to him as they walked toward the car. Dad, do you think Bear needs braces too? Callum stopped mid-step. She looked up at him, blinking. I said it, didn't I? He crouched, level with her eyes. You can call me whatever you want. She thought for a second. I like Dad. Then I love it. After that, it came easier, softer, like it had always been there, waiting. The one thing Callum hadn't expected was how much people changed around her. Jody started visiting more often, at first for paperwork, then just because. She brought cookies and coloring books, and sometimes she and Daisy would sit in the garden while Callum took calls. His executive team, once terrified of missteps around their calculating CEO, began bringing small gifts, books, puzzles, little hair clips they saw in stores, and thought Daisy might like this. His driver, Marcus, started keeping mints in the glove compartment. She says they help with car tummy, Marcus told him with a shrug. The world didn't get easier, but it became gentler because of her. One Saturday morning, Daisy appeared in the doorway of his office, barefoot and pajama-clad, holding Bear upside down by one leg. Can I tell you something? She asked. He set his laptop aside, always. I had a dream last night. Mom was in it. She said it's okay to be happy again. Callum's chest tightened. She really said that? Daisy nodded. She was in the garden. She was smiling. He pulled her onto his lap, kissed the top of her head. I think she'd be proud of you, he said. I think she'd like you, Daisy said, even if you talk a lot in business words. Callum laughed through the sting in his eyes. Months passed. Daisy's room became an explosion of color. Stuffed animals lined the bed. Twinkle lights draped across the ceiling. The art room filled with crayon masterpieces and glittered paper snowflakes that stayed up long past winter. Callum read books on parenting. He met with therapists, child development experts, even trauma counselors, anything to understand her better, to give her what she needed before she even asked. Not because he felt guilty, but because he loved her more than he had words for. One day in early summer, Daisy came home from school holding a permission slip. It's for the family picnic, she said. We're supposed to bring someone. He raised an eyebrow. Like who? She looked at him like he'd missed the obvious. You, duh. He blinked. You want me to come? She nodded. Some kids don't bring anyone, but I want you there. I'll be there, he said instantly. She held out the paper. You have to sign it. It's legal. He signed it with exaggerated flair. There, legally obligated to eat tiny hot dogs and sit on itchy grass. She beamed. You'll be the fanciest dad there. Let's just hope I don't scare the bounce house guy. The picnic was a blur of sun and shouting children. Daisy introduced him to every teacher, every friend, even the janitor. This is my dad, she said proudly, over and over. He works in a tall building and makes toast without burning it now. Callum took photos, too many probably, and laughed more than he had in years. When Daisy sat in his lap to eat her hot dog, ketchup dripping on his pants, he didn't even care. Later, while the kids played tug-of-war, one of the teachers came to sit beside him. She's a remarkable girl, she said. I know. She told me her mom used to say the world breaks you open and then fills you up again if you let it. Callum looked at Daisy, muddy and laughing in the sun. Her mother was right. One evening, months after she first walked into the lobby with Bear in her arms, Callum tucked her into bed after reading Charlotte's Web. Are you going to work tomorrow? She asked sleepily. Not until after breakfast. Will you make the French toast with the powdered sugar? Absolutely. She curled into her pillow, Bear snuggled under her chin. I'm glad you were in the lobby that day. So am I. Silence fell. Then, very softly, I was scared, but then I saw your eyes, and I wasn't. He brushed her hair back. You were the bravest person in that building. No, she murmured. You were. After she fell asleep, Callum sat outside her door for a while, just breathing, just listening to the quiet. The past year had broken him open, and somehow Daisy had filled every corner he'd once thought was hollow. He used to cry over deals lost, empires shaken, legacy questioned. Now the only thing that ever brought tears to his eyes was the sound of his daughter breathing steady in the next room. He didn't need anything else, because she had walked into his life, and everything had changed, forever. That summer turned out to be the most ordinary and extraordinary of Callum's life, not because of the travel or parties or lavish galas his life used to orbit around, but because of the little things. Ordinary mornings with spilled cereal and tangled braids. Saturday afternoons spent at playgrounds with rusted monkey bars and kids shouting each other's names across fields. Evenings filled with Daisy's laughter echoing from the hallway as she ran around in socks too big for her feet. He started keeping his calendar light. Meetings were moved. Dinners postponed. For the first time, Callum Lowell was known not just as the CEO who closed record-breaking deals, but as the man who turned down a video conference with the European board because my daughter has a school recital. And when that recital came, he wore the ugliest paper flower pinned to his suit lapel, crafted by Daisy's hands, wilted slightly by the time the curtain rose, and sat in the second row of the school auditorium, recording every second on his phone with trembling hands. She sang one verse, off-key, loud. He cried through the whole thing. Later that night, he knelt by her bed and told her she was braver than any performer he'd ever seen. She giggled and whispered, "I saw you cry." "You made me proud," he said, brushing her hair from her face. "You were proud before," she murmured. "Yes," he said, "but now the whole world knows." The truth was, he had changed. It wasn't just the home, though it did change. Walls painted soft greens and yellows, a bookshelf in every room, rugs layered over cold marble to soften the sounds of Daisy's footsteps. It wasn't just the schedule, though that changed too, meetings bookended by school drop-offs, and every Friday blocked out for Daisy time. What changed was his heart. He didn't look at numbers the same way anymore. He looked at meaning. Did this investment help a community? Did this acquisition create opportunity? Or just money? He no longer made decisions from behind a shield of profits. He made them with a child's voice echoing in his ears. Are promises always true? He tried every day to live like the answer was yes. In August, on a trip to the beach, Daisy asked a question that shifted the ground beneath his feet all over again. They were sitting in the sand, eating popsicles, watching the waves crash, while Bear sat propped against a bucket beside them. She was drawing shapes with a stick in the wet sand when she said casually, "Do you think my mom can see me from the stars?" Callum blinked at the horizon. "I think she sees you everywhere, especially when you laugh. Do you think she knows I'm okay now?" He nodded. "I think she knows you're loved." Daisy was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned to him, eyes clear and certain. "Will you adopt me?" He froze. He had wanted to ask her for months, but every time he worried he was pushing too fast, too soon, that maybe her heart hadn't healed enough yet. But she had asked him, and his voice nearly cracked under the weight of it. "If you'll let me," he said softly, "nothing would make me prouder." She smiled then, wide and full and radiant in a way that seemed to stretch across the sand and sky and every part of his life that had once felt empty. The adoption process wasn't easy. There were more evaluations, more home visits, more reviews of his life, his past, his intentions, his history with Ellie, the missed years. But every time a form arrived in the mail, Daisy would meet him at the door with a highlighter and a sticker. "So they know you're serious," she'd say, placing a gold star beside the signature line. He met with a child psychologist who said Daisy was adjusting better than anyone could have hoped. He answered questions about parenting philosophy, discipline style, emergency preparedness. He installed fire alarms in every room, bought a new family-sized car with booster seats, enrolled in a CPR class. The same hands that once signed contracts worth billions now spent hours assembling bunk beds, labeling school supplies, writing out a birthday invitation list that included every single child in Daisy's class, even the one who'd accidentally spilled juice on Bear. On the morning of the final court date, Daisy wore a dress covered in tiny stars. Bear had a miniature bow tie again, and Callum wore the same suit he had worn the day she found him in the lobby, because that was the day his life had truly begun. They walked into the courthouse, hand in hand. The judge looked different this time, not weary, but almost smiling. She read over the case summary with a steady voice, eyes flicking between them. Then she looked at Daisy. "You understand what adoption means?" she asked gently. Daisy nodded. "It means he's my dad forever." "And that's what you want?" "Yes." The judge turned to Callum. "And you, Mr. Lowell." He didn't hesitate. "More than anything in the world." She gave a single solemn nod. "Then I declare this adoption legal and binding. Congratulations, Mr. Lowell, and welcome home, Daisy." The gavel fell. Daisy turned to Callum and launched herself into his arms. He caught her, lifting her easily, tears sliding down his face as the courtroom burst into quiet applause. Later, outside, surrounded by sun and city noise, and a sky so blue it felt surreal, Daisy leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "Can I change my name now?" "What do you want it to be?" he asked. "Daisy Hart Lowell," she said. Callum smiled. "Perfect." The years that followed unfolded in slow, beautiful layers. First grade, then second. A loose tooth lost during breakfast that required an emergency trip to the dentist, and 4 stickers. Bear finally retired to a shelf, though he still wore his court day bow tie. Daisy joined the art club, won second place in a statewide drawing contest, told Callum she wanted to be a children's book author. "Write about what you know," he told her. "I know about starting over," she said. So she wrote a story about a girl and a bear who walked into a tall building and found a heart that had been sleeping. Callum cried reading it. Daisy rolled her eyes. "You cry every time someone hugs in a movie." "Some of us are emotionally evolved. Some of us are just marshmallows." He laughed, kissed the top of her head, and saved the manuscript in a fireproof box. One day, years later, she would grow up. She would pack for college, hug Bear one last time, leave the house that had become more than just shelter. But not yet. For now, every morning, Callum still rose early to make her breakfast, still tucked her in at night, still stood in doorways just to hear her breathing. Because once she had walked into his lobby holding nothing but a teddy bear and a letter that changed everything. And now she was his daughter, not by blood, but by choice, by love, by every moment that followed that first impossible one. Daisy's 8th birthday came in a whirlwind of sugar, sidewalk chalk, and helium balloons that kept bumping against the vaulted ceilings. Callum had hired a magician, not because he thought Daisy particularly loved magic, but because she'd once watched a street performer for a full 20 minutes, with her mouth open, eyes wide, whispering, "How did he do that?" So when the magician pulled a bouquet of paper flowers out of a cereal box, Daisy screamed with delight. When the rabbit appeared from a hat, she clutched Callum's sleeve so hard he thought he'd lose circulation again, and when the magician finished by turning Bear's raggedy ear into a shimmering coin that Daisy got to keep, she stood up on a chair and clapped until her palms turned red. Callum had never seen her glow like that. It wasn't about the presents, though there were many, or the elaborate cake with edible glitter. It was about the fact that she was seen, known, celebrated. When the other children left and the house was finally quiet, Callum found her in the living room, curled up on the rug in her sparkly birthday dress, Bear beside her, the silver coin resting in her palm. He sat beside her, slow and careful. "Did you have fun?" She nodded. "The best day ever." Callum smiled, but she turned to him, brows knitting together slightly. "You know," she said slowly, "I never had a birthday party before." He blinked. "Never?" She shook her head. "Mom would make pancakes, and we'd watch a movie, but it was just us. We moved a lot." Callum reached for her hand, curling her fingers gently over the coin. "Well, now you've had one, and next year we'll do it again. Maybe with a theme next time," she said dreamily, "like dinosaurs, or astronauts, or dinosaurs in space." "That's ambitious," he said. "I'm an author now. I have range." Callum laughed. Her writing took off faster than he expected. Not in the publishing sense. She was still a child, still learning spelling rules and how to use quotation marks. But her mind worked in arcs and metaphors and scenes. She wrote stories in the back seat of the car, in her bedroom, on napkins at restaurants. One story she titled "The Lobby Girl." It was about a girl who walked into a giant glass building with nothing but a bear and a name. Callum read it late one night and couldn't finish it without wiping his eyes. She had drawn him with a square jaw and stick-figure arms holding a clipboard labeled "Important Stuff." But in the final page, he dropped it and picked up the girl instead. Underneath, she'd written in her careful, slanted hand, "Some magic isn't about rabbits or hats. Sometimes it's about people who who stay. The following winter brought something neither of them expected. Daisy fell ill. Nothing serious at first. A fever, a sore throat, a few days off school. But one morning, she didn't get out of bed at all. Her cheeks were flushed with heat, and when Callum touched her forehead, she whimpered. He scooped her up without hesitation and carried her straight to the car. The pediatrician ran tests, her face tightening with each result. "It's not dangerous," she assured Callum, "but it's stubborn. A bacterial infection, antibiotics, rest, fluids. You caught it in time." But the way Daisy curled into his chest in the hospital waiting room, eyes half closed, murmuring, "Don't go," made something inside him break all over again. "I'm right here," he said, over and over. "I'm not going anywhere." For a week he didn't leave her side. He slept in a chair next to her bed, fed her soup when she could eat, read her every book on her shelf, and let her cry at 2 a.m. when she woke up in a panic. "You're safe," he'd whisper, holding her close. "You're safe. You're home." When the fever broke and the color returned to her face, he wept alone in the hallway for a full 10 minutes before composing himself. Because he'd learned something in that week. He hadn't adopted Daisy just to save her from being alone. He'd needed her just as much, maybe more. Daisy's 8th birthday came in a whirlwind of sugar, sidewalk chalk, and helium balloons that kept bumping against the vaulted ceilings. Callum had hired a magician, not because he thought Daisy particularly loved magic, but because she'd once watched a street performer for a full 20 minutes with her mouth open, eyes wide, whispering, "How did he do that?" So when the magician pulled a bouquet of paper flowers out of a cereal box, Daisy screamed with delight. When the rabbit appeared from a hat, she clutched Callum's sleeve so hard he thought he'd lose circulation again. And when the magician finished by turning Bear's raggedy ear into a shimmering coin that Daisy got to keep, she stood up on a chair and clapped until her palms turned red. Callum had never seen her glow like that. It wasn't about the presents, though there were many, or the elaborate cake with edible glitter. It was about the fact that she was seen, known, celebrated. When the other children left and the house was finally quiet, Callum found her in the living room, curled up on the rug in her sparkly birthday dress, Bear beside her, the silver coin resting in her palm. He sat beside her, slow and careful. "Did you have fun?" She nodded. "The best day ever." Callum smiled, but she turned to him, brows knitting together slightly. "You know," she said slowly, "I never had a birthday party before." He blinked. "Never?" She shook her head. "Mom would make pancakes and we'd watch a movie, but it was just us. We moved a lot." Callum reached for her hand, curling her fingers gently over the coin. "Well, now you've had one, and next year we'll do it again. Maybe with a theme next time," she said dreamily, "like dinosaurs or astronauts or dinosaurs in space." "That's ambitious," he said. "I'm an author now. I have range," Callum laughed. Her writing took off faster than he expected. Not in the publishing sense. She was still a child, still learning spelling rules and how to use quotation marks, but her mind worked in arcs and metaphors and scenes. She wrote stories in the back seat of the car, in her bedroom, on napkins at restaurants. One story she titled The Lobby Girl. It was about a girl who walked into a giant glass building with nothing but a bear and a name. Callum read it late one night and couldn't finish it without wiping his eyes. She had drawn him with a square jaw and stick-figure arms holding a clipboard labeled "Important Stuff." But in the final page he dropped it and picked up the girl instead. Underneath, she'd written in her careful, slanted hand, "Some magic isn't about rabbits or hats. Sometimes it's about people who stay." The following winter brought something neither of them expected. Daisy fell ill, nothing serious at first. A fever, a sore throat, a few days off school. But one morning, she didn't get out of bed at all. Her cheeks were flushed with heat, and when Callum touched her forehead, she whimpered. He scooped her up without hesitation and carried her straight to the car. The pediatrician ran tests, her face tightening with each result. "It's not dangerous," she assured Callum, "but it's stubborn. A bacterial infection, antibiotics, rest, fluids. You caught it in time." But the way Daisy curled into his chest in the hospital waiting room, eyes half closed, murmuring, "Don't go," made something inside him break all over again. "I'm right here," he said over and over. "I'm not going anywhere." For a week, he didn't leave her side. He slept in a chair next to her bed, fed her soup when she could eat, read her every book on her shelf, and let her cry at 2 in the morning when she woke up in a panic. "You're safe," he'd whisper, holding her close. "You're safe. You're home." When the fever broke and the color returned to her face, he wept alone in the hallway for a full 10 minutes before composing himself. Because he'd learned something in that week. He hadn't adopted Daisy just to save her from being alone. He'd needed her just as much, maybe more. Spring returned with a gentle persistence, unfurling new leaves on the trees outside their windows and waking the garden from its sleep. Daisy took to spending hours out there, barefoot in the soft grass, a sketchbook in her lap and Bear sitting guard beside her like some tiny sentinel. Callum often watched from the kitchen window, coffee in hand, pretending he wasn't utterly in awe of her stillness, her imagination, the way she filled the quiet with something sacred. She drew pictures of stars and lighthouses, of dragons curled around tiny houses, of girls who looked like her with words hovering above their heads like floating spells. "This one's about being scared and doing it anyway," she told him one evening, holding up a drawing of a girl climbing a ladder into the clouds. "That's courage," he said. She shrugged, but he saw the corner of her mouth lift. "It's just what you do when no one else will." He nodded. "Yeah, that's courage." They settled into life more deeply with every season. The rhythms grew familiar, brushing teeth to the sound of silly songs, library trips on Thursdays, pancake Sundays where flour always ended up in Daisy's hair and Callum's shirt sleeves. The house, once austere and echoing, now pulsed with warmth and color. Daisy's fingerprints were everywhere. On the refrigerator, in the framed photos lining the hallway, in the pile of shoes near the door. And Callum let them stay. He had spent years keeping everything spotless, but now he saw beauty in the mess. In the way she left her books half open, in the trail of glitter from an art project, in the faint smell of strawberries that seemed to cling to her wherever she went. One night she came into his room holding a pillow and wearing a solemn expression. "Dad?" she whispered. He was already sitting up, reaching for the blanket. "Nightmare?" She nodded and climbed into the bed without hesitation, curling against his side. "It was about the day I came to find you," she said. "But this time you weren't there. I just stood there forever." His chest tightened. "I'm here," he said. "I'll always be here." She nestled closer. "I know. I think I just needed to hear it again." So he said it again, and again, until she fell asleep and he lay awake, watching her breathe, wondering how he had ever lived without this kind of love. Later that month she asked about Ellie again. It happened sometimes, randomly, gently, like a thread she was tugging at to make sense of her history. They sat on the porch, sharing a bowl of peaches. "Do you think she'd be okay with all this?" Daisy asked. "Us?" Callum nodded. "I think she'd be proud of you, of how strong and kind and smart you are." "But what about you?" He looked at her, startled. "What about me? Do you think she'd be okay with me calling you Dad?" The question landed in his chest with a weight he wasn't prepared for. He set down the bowl and turned to her. "I think she'd be grateful." Daisy's eyes didn't waver. "You don't have to say that just to make me feel better." "I'm not," he said. "I think Ellie wanted you to have someone who would love you all the way through. And I think, no, I know, she picked me on purpose." Daisy didn't say anything right away, but she rested her head on his shoulder and let out a long, slow breath, and in that breath was the sound of something old being released, a fear, a memory, a grief that had sat in her bones since she was small. "Do you ever miss who you were before I came?" she asked. He shook his head. "I didn't really exist before you, not like this." She smiled. "I think I kind of feel the same." They stayed on the porch until the sun slipped behind the trees, and long after Daisy had fallen asleep against his chest, Callum remained still, watching the stars come out one by one. He thought about the man he used to be, sharp-edged, always in motion, afraid of stillness. And he thought about now, this life, this love, this girl who had walked into his world and given him a second chance at everything. The school sent home a letter in September. Family Tree Project. Due in 2 weeks. Daisy handed it to Callum at the kitchen table, her lips twisted in that serious, thoughtful way she often wore when something unsettled her. He read the instructions aloud. Draw your family tree. Include names, relationships, and a few facts about each person. She waited until he finished, then asked quietly, "Can I do mine different?" He set the paper down and met her eyes. "Different how?" "I don't have branches like the other kids. It's more like a root that broke, and then another one started growing." That image, delicate, brilliant, precise, landed in his heart like a stone dropped in the water. "I think that sounds like the most honest tree there is," he said. "We'll make it however you want." They sat together that weekend with a roll of parchment paper spread across the dining table. Daisy drew a tree, slightly bent, with a jagged line through one root, but from the broken place she painted new roots curling downward and fresh branches stretching wide above. She labeled the roots Mom and Me. On the biggest new branch she wrote Dad, Callum, and below that added Bear, Non-Human Emotional Support, in careful block letters. Another branch held Jody's name, and one for Marcus and Clara, the social worker. "They helped," she said when he asked. "They're not in every picture, but they matter." When it was done, she stepped back, studying it with her hands on her hips. "This is us," she said. The teacher displayed it in the hallway with the rest. Callum saw it during parent night. He stood there for a long time in front of her tree, surrounded by stiff poster boards filled with traditional branches and boxes and predictable names. Daisy's drawing wasn't flashy, but it was alive, honest, and somewhere in the corner she'd drawn a heart at the base of the trunk and labeled it, "Where I Started Again." That night he wrote her a letter and left it on her pillow. It said only one thing, "You grew me too." The next day she ran down the hallway at school drop-off and hugged him so hard his knees almost buckled. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me," she whispered. Callum couldn't even get the words out to say it back, not with his throat clenched the way it was, so he just held her tighter. Sometimes silence said it better anyway. Fall deepened. The house smelled like apples and cinnamon, thanks to a baking obsession Daisy developed after watching 3 episodes of a cooking show. "I'm going to open a bakery," she announced one Saturday, flour on her cheeks, her hands sticky with dough, "and you'll be my taste tester, but only if you're honest." Callum took a bite of a lopsided sugar cookie. "I'll do my best, but I may be biased, because I love you." She grinned. "You can't taste bias. You either like the cookie or you don't." "Then I love the cookie, and you." Good answer. By Thanksgiving, they had built new traditions. They invited Jody and Marcus and Clara. Daisy made a gratitude garland, where everyone had to write what they were thankful for on slips of paper. Callum's read, "For the day she walked into the lobby." Daisy said, "For the hug that didn't let go." After everyone left that night, she sat beside him on the couch, legs tucked under her, Bear resting on the cushion between them. "Do you think I'll remember everything?" she asked softly. "Like this, us?" He nodded. "Memories stay longer when they're real. What if I forget how scared I was?" "Then we'll keep telling the story," So you remember how far you came." She rested her head on his shoulder. "I like that you remember with me." Winter came again, softer this time, not with the weight of fear or the shadow of uncertainty, but with quiet warmth and light. On the anniversary of the day she walked into the lobby, Daisy woke early, crept into Callum's room, and crawled beneath the covers without saying a word. He wrapped his arms around her instinctively, just like he had that first night when she was small and scared and everything was unknown. They lay there in silence until the sun filtered through the blinds, and then she whispered, "Do you ever think about that day?" He nodded against her hair. "Every single day." She pulled Bear closer to her chest. "I think maybe I didn't just find you. Maybe you were waiting for me, too." He closed his eyes, emotion catching in his throat, and whispered, "I was." When they got up later, she found an envelope on her breakfast plate. Inside was a letter, one he'd written a year ago, sealed and saved, labeled, "To be opened when everything is real." She read it slowly, smiling as tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. Then she hugged him, long and tight. "You kept your promise," she said, "every word of it." And Callum, once a man who measured his life in contracts and deadlines, knew there was no greater success than being someone a child could count on.